come back for the second. India have won the test match. India have won the series. They're going to get back for two. India at home. Lords goes wild.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of the 81 All Out podcast. This is your host, Siddhartha Vaidyanathan, and I'm happy to be joined today by a very special guest, a revered broadcaster from the Caribbean, someone who over the years has come to be known as one of the voices of West Indian cricket, Joseph Reds Perreira. I'm going to be calling him Reds throughout the show. Yes, so happy to have you here, Reds. A wonderful privilege for us to have you on the show.
Well, it's an honor to be part of your show. The great 7 weeks to late once said, it's nice to be remembered.
Absolutely. I must mention here to many of our listeners who are not aware that Reds is one of the most prolific radio commentators and broadcasters of all time. He has covered 152 test matches. Take a deep breath on that. And close to 500 other games that include one-day internationals and first-class games and list A games and all the other games that you can put into it. In 2019, during the India-West Indies test at Sabina Park, which was Reds' 150th test, some of you might remember there was a special moment during a break where Reds was felicitated by the cricket board. So, yes, wonderful to have you here. Reds has also written a lovely book called Living My Dreams, which I will link to, where he talks about his growing up years and his broadcasting years. And it's also, I must mention here that apart from being such a prolific cricket broadcaster and commentator, Reds has also done an enormous amount for other sport in the Caribbean, and whether it's Olympics or basketball or everything else. He has covered 5 Cricket World Cups, and that is a lot of World Cups. But if you read the book, you realize that there are also so many other special occasions like the Olympics and various other boxing bouts that he has attended. So Reds, take us back a bit. You're back to the time in the 30s and 40s where you were growing up in Guyana, and tell us a bit about your love for the game and how your love for cricket developed.
Well, I was born in the Essequibo River, in one of the smaller rivers called the Pomeroon. My father was a humble farmer, and we had some knowledge of the game called cricket. And my father will take us to watch a cricket match, which was really almost like a festival that led to music and dancing after. But I really only began to get into the game when we came to Georgetown from the Pomeroon to go to school. And we had to learn about life in the city. And slowly but surely, I began to listen to the sports news, and then I began to follow the cricket news. And, I was 8 years of age when I came to Georgetown, and, it was a new beginning, so to speak. Very, very shortly after that, there was 1950, and Raman Val and Weeks Worrell and Walcott, and the West Indies dominated England, and all the commentary was coming through. John Allott, Rex Austin, E.W. Swanton, you name it. And I got attracted to the commentary and the poetry of the commentary and the intensity of the commentary. And I listened to, in 1951, on the back of a chair. I was about 11 years old when the West Indies went to Australia. And I listened to Johnny Moyes and Alan McGilvery and Michael Charlton. They have a different style than the English. And I like the intensity. But I must also tell you that as a child growing up, I had a major stammering problem. So my love for the game, I don't think I had any thoughts of ever turning into a commentator, because I just didn't have the wherewithal, so to speak. It was the reality, but that didn't stop me from following the game. And I saw my first Test match in 1953 with V.S. Hazari leading India, with Ramchan and Gupti and M.L. Apti and Gaikwad and, all the Indian players at that period. And that basically was my early start.
Fantastic. Yes, remarkable indeed that given that the challenges that you had with stammering early on, that you went on to become such a prolific broadcaster. I mean, I think it's a really inspirational story for anyone who is struggling, not just with stammering, but any kind of speech impediment, that how someone like you could actually bridge that gap and go on to do that, which then brings me to cricket commentary. There is a certain rhythm to cricket commentary, isn't it? Especially the radio broadcast, that can really help one become a better speaker and a better talker if one practices it. And you have mentioned too in the book and in some interviews about how you used to actually repeat what several cricket commentators said, and that really helped you overcome this impediment.
Well, my mother was, one person who played a major role. She would allow me to lie in bed, and I will do imaginary commentaries on Lindwall bowling to Worrell and Statham bowling to Sobers and Kanai, and I will do imaginary test matches and do a couple of overs from Trent Bridge. I might describe the weather being overcast and gloomy and so cold and grey, not even a bird will appear. And she allowed me to fantasize, and I did football matches with England versus Brazil, and I did the great boxing matches from Madison Square Garden with Ezra Charles against Joe Walcott and Joe Louis against Max Mellon. And, it was an opportunity to use words that I will not normally use.
Can you give us an example?
Well, I couldn't say Richardson. I couldn't say Richards. I couldn't say Rodriguez. I struggled to say Sri Lanka, right? And the S's and R's gave me heaps of trouble.
Absolutely, yes. It's wonderful that you were able to, use cricket as a device by means of getting over it. In your book, though, I mean, talking about cricket and the love for the game, in your book, you mention a lovely little anecdote about a gentleman in Guyana who back maybe in the 40s or 50s, way before technology had arrived in those parts and way before we had things like the internet, he used to have a board outside his store where he used to write the scores of every major game that was going on in the world. And he used to update that every once in a while. So people used to go to the store just to check out what was happening in, say, New Zealand or in England, and just have a nice little conversation around it. I found that a really wonderful anecdote.
It was a Guyanese of Chinese origin. He ran a shop, better describe it that way, where you have pastries and you have soft drinks and whatever not. And he listened to the BBC, obviously, a lot, because Sports Roundup came down the line, and he will have all the county matches of the day, and he will have all the updates on the international matches. And scores of people, I'm talking about 20, 30 people, will be outside of his shop. And when I started to do some work for a radio station, I might get the latest scores by going there. And sometimes I might actually go there at 6 o'clock in the morning to get the latest score before I go on to the radio station. So he was unique. I mean, cricket lovers are a very special person, and you can't just buy that. You have to have that within you.
Absolutely. One of the other things that strikes me when I read the book is how much of an initiative you had to take to actually get into the broadcasting business. I mean, it was not like you walked into a radio station and then you got a chance. You actually traveled all around the Caribbean, and there were times in which you spent quite a bit of money and went to Jamaica and to just watch events and to get to know the game. So there was a tremendous amount of personal initiative that you had to take to actually get into the business, isn't it?
Yes, well, I watched all the matches at the test ground border. There was the intercolonial series where all the Caribbean nations came to Guyana. So there was a lot of cricket to watch. And I would go to Trinidad, which is about an hour away, and see the test matches at the Oval. And I will get into the box and sit behind the commentators and hear their style and, just get au fait about the ball by ball and things like that. And it was one way of picking up knowledge and gaining experience. So when my time came, I would have been there and done that in a sense before I did my first test match and my first class game.
So would it be fair to say that the first test match was sometime in this, was the series against India in 71, or was it much before that?
No, my first test match was 71. My first class game was 1969. Guyana played Jamaica at Sabina Park. And then I did Barbados, Guyana. I did the Combined Islands, Guyana and Dominica. But my first test match was 1971 when Gavaskar scored all those runs on Sardisai. And a great Indian commentator was part of the broadcast team, Berry Sabatakari. That was my first test match, 1971.
So you began with Sunil Gavaskar pretty much, both of you together.
Funny enough, he didn't play in the first test. I think Jayanti Lal opened the innings. I'm told he might have been hurt or not well. Or
he had a finger injury, I think. Yeah.
But he started at border and did he continue? There's a great calypso made by Lord Relator, which you must Google and play it on your show.
Yes, I will link it for sure. It is a wonderful calypso. Not at all. You couldn't get Gavaskar out at all. So that's and it also has lovely mentions of all the players who played in that series and that tour.
And it started beautifully. Lovely day for cricket, blue skies and gentle breeze. I wouldn't go anymore.
I shouldn't stop you. You have a good voice. You have a great voice.
No. Let's get back to the main discussion.
I have to mention a little anecdote when you mentioned that calypso. In that calypso, Lord Relator, in a small part of it, mentions that Joey Carew, who was one of the players at that time, he pulled a muscle during the series and he couldn't play. So he says Joey Carew pulled a muscle, and that's all he says about Joey Carew. But then in 2006, I met Joey Carew. He was a West Indies selector at the time, and I was talking to him about 71. And I then said, I do know one thing about you in that series, that you pulled a muscle. And he says, how on earth do you have that bit of information? And I said, I listened to the Calypso, and that's all it told me.
Yep.
Yes. So moving to the 70s, you write very fondly about the 1975 World Cup in England, which, West Indies, of course, won that famous final when Clive Lloyd made that 100, and the longest day of the year when Australia tried to chase it down but couldn't. Tell us a bit about 75, what an impact it had on you, and of course that famous game when Derek Murray and Andy Roberts took West Indies home against Pakistan.
Well, after India, I got an opportunity to do the New Zealand tour in 72, and then Australia came with Ian Chappell in 73. And by that time, Tony Kosher was well established, and the Caribbean Broadcasting Union decided they will send a team, and they worked with the English authorities and the Caribbean organization based in London for broadcasting. And we were inserted with all the English commentators, John Allott, Christopher Martin Jenkins, Henry Blofeld, and Trevor Bailey, and Freddie Truman. And we covered all of the West Indies matches which went back live to the Caribbean and maybe live to other parts of the world. And it was a great occasion. I mean, the West Indies started well and did well throughout, except that game against Pakistan, because it was played at Edgbaston, and had the West Indies lost, we would have been able to pack our bags and head home, because the West Indies would have been out. It was, I think, a kind of a quarterfinal. It's so long ago, I can't remember whether it was a quarterfinal. But what seemed to be a very small score, with all the West Indies batting lineup available, you thought that the West Indies would have won. You had a great start of Fredericks and Greenwich at the top, and then the illustrious names that followed. Well, sometimes, one leaves it for the other. Well, if Kanai doesn't get it, Richards will get it, or Lloyd will get it, or Calitran will get it. Well, nobody really got it. And we were 203 for 9 when Andy Montgomery Roberts walked out to join Derek Murray. And by that time, the man of the match adjudicator Tom Graveney had already awarded a Pakistani the award for man of the match. Not knowing that the great stand of 64 runs, and the entire Edgbaston was standing up. It was a single here and a single there and 2 here, and the West Indies got to 220 for 9 and 230 for 9, 245 for 9. I mean, it was like a theater, it was like a theater in a sense. When Andy Roberts eventually pushed, I think the bowler was Amanat, down to mid-on and ran for the winning single, Roberts kept running totally and ran totally off, left Murray standing. And of course, the crowds ran on. And speaking after to the late Sir Clyde Walker, who was the manager of the West Indies team, he said, big men cried after that last run. And during the drama of the stand, nobody in the West Indies dressing room wanted to leave their chair. They might have wanted to go and get the refreshment. They might wanted to go to the toilet. But just in case their action had somehow or the other affected what was happening in the middle, they just didn't want to move. And I mean, I think the Pakistanis had their celebrations planned. It was a total relief when the West Indies won that.
And you had quite an extended session of commentating on that game right at the end, right?
Yes, I had taken over. I think it was Tony Cozier, it was an English commentator, and then myself. And I should have handed to somebody else. And when I started to suggest there'll be a change, they said, no, keep going. Don't change the commentator. They just felt that, what looks good keep good. And I actually did the last ball, and I must tell you honestly, there were tears in my eyes.
Wonderful. And I think the bowler would have been Wasim Raja, because when I'm looking at the scorecard, it's Wasim Raja who has finished that game. So, but the one other thing about that game, though, is that the current West Indies commentator, again, one of the fantastic voices of Caribbean cricket, Fazir Mohammed, has mentioned how he was a young boy when he heard the radio commentary of that match, when he was perhaps listening to you calling that match. And he said how that match and that finish really helped him get the bug of cricket commentary and the love for cricket commentary. So it just shows how listening to a game of cricket or watching a game of cricket and hearing someone can inspire somebody else. And it's amazing how you calling the game, you itself and Tony Cozier and everyone else calling the game inspired Fazir, who is now such a big name in commentary.
Yes, I think that was a blessing in disguise that he was motivated by that. But I think how the game ended, I think really, I'm told that in the Caribbean, traffic stop, buses stop, Parliament stop, cabinet stop. Everybody just could not move away until it was all finished. I mean, it was high drama.
Yes, it was high drama. And then, of course, you should tell us about the final, because it was the first Men's World Cup, and the game went on late, longest day of the year, as I mentioned. And eventually, West Indies ended up winning that memorable match.
Yes, it was quite an honor to do the final along with Tony Cozier, along with Brian Johnson, Trevor Bailey, Freddie Truman. And the West Indies didn't start all that well because we were 3 for 51 when I got my first stint. Fredericks had hook Lily for 6, but slid onto the stump. He had gone. Greenwich then went. Calitran then went. And when I got on my first stint, Rohan Kanai was coming out to join Kanai. He originally was not in the side. Gary Sobers pulled out. Kanai was at it. And what a tremendous partnership of contrast between Captain Lloyd and Kanai. It was the power of Lloyd off the back foot or driving, and the silky touch of Kanai late cutting, driving gracefully through extra cover. It was a marvelous fight back when Australia seemed to have picked up the upper hand early.
Yes. Talking about Clive Lloyd, I mean, you must tell us a bit. I mean, many of our younger listeners may not be aware of what a phenomenal batsman he could be, especially in the one-day game with that absolutely, that backlift and that big bat and the power that he came with. As somebody who perhaps saw him from a very early stage of his career, you must tell us something about the aura of Sir Clive Lloyd.
Well, I saw him playing in a trial match where Guyana was trying to put together a trial match to pick their team. And you could see he was very young. He was working at the Ministry of Health, and he was playing for the Demerara Cricket Club. And, he had all the potential, but he was made to wait. He was made to wait. For example, initially, he didn't do all that well in his first regional match. Someone, I think, said to the then manager, the late Bertrand Gaskin, who had played 2 test matches for the West Indies, your boy didn't do well. He said, please wait. He got 196 against Jamaica in the next match. And there was some people feeling that he should have gone to England in '66. The then West Indies great Sir Frank Worrell said to him, don't be disappointed. You might have gone to England, you might have gotten a good ball, you might have just got off to a bad start. And he got picked for 1967. And he was not to play in the first test, but Seymour Nurse got ill overnight. And in about a half an hour before the game started, Sir Garfield Sobers says, Clive, you're in. He got 80 odd in his first innings, and I think he got runs in the second innings. He was quick for a big man, powerful off the back foot, strong through the covers. And, if he had played 2020 cricket, I mean, he played a lot of ODI cricket, and he loved it. He was brilliant in the field. I mean, they call him the super cat. He was brilliant at cover point. And what a lot of people didn't know, he actually bowled a little bit in that World Cup final. People would be surprised, but it was a great final. And Australia, had their chances. Richards, brilliant in the covers, had 5 runouts. And, at one time, it was touch and go, but it was a great final and a great day to be alive.
Absolutely. 5 runouts in a World Cup final. I wonder when that is going to happen again. Vivian Richards just stamping his authority over the field on that day, which then forwards me to 75-76 when West Indies went to Australia. And you again write about that series where you had to, you traveled there as a freelancer. And it's really interesting how, you bring out the era and how it was for people who were freelancing at the time and who were journalists, and the kindness of people in cricket, and how cricket got you in touch with so many people and also helped you make so many friends on that trip.
Yes, when you go on as a freelancer, you're on a low budget, very low budget. And you really need to cut corners. Well, first of all, you got to make yourself available to appear in every talk show you're invited to, even if you have to make an extra special effort to get there. And I was able to do all the first-class matches for ABC Radio, which brought in a little bit of money along with Jim Maxwell and Neville Oliver, and I think Tim Lane, if I remember well. And I did manage to contact some Australians I knew way back in England in '63. And they offered me accommodation in Melbourne. The liaison officer for the test match in South Australia, their family invited me. Their mother and father, they were school teachers, invited me to spend the test match period with them. You had that operating throughout all the test matches. There was always an opportunity provided by people because of the hospitality. And there were West Indians who also reached out to me. There was a Trinidad couple in Melbourne, Kensington, Melbourne, not too far away from the ground. Kester and Pat Thomas, who opened their hospitality to me. But yeah, it was a great experience. The cricket wasn't a great experience, but up to the second test, the West Indies looked like they would have been competitive after losing the first. Great Roy Fredericks got 169, one of the best knocks ever in Australia. And nobody remembers that Clive Lloyd also scored 100 in that test match that the West Indies won.
I was in fact going to come exactly to that game and to that innings because, there are several days in the past, of course, that you wish you had been able to go back to and watch the cricket. But this is one day that I think I would have loved to be there on that day in Perth when Roy Fredericks on a trampoline of a pitch, a pitch with a trampoline kind of bounce, went after Lilly and Thompson and Walker and sort of made one of the great hundreds of all time. You should tell us about that innings and how it was as a spectacle, simply just being there at Perth and watching that.
Well, I mean, the Australian bowling was fast and furious and aggressive. And Fredericks was one not to back away. Fredericks attacked fast bowlers. And on that day, he decided, well, you are going to bounce at me. I'm going to hook. I'm going to cut. In the earlies, there were a couple of top edges. But he soon settled down. And he slaughtered Lilly, Gilmore, Thompson, Walker. Greg Chappell by then had taken over the captaincy from his brother Ian. And the rate of scoring by the West Indies was so quick that at one time Greg turned to his brother Ian and said, what can I do? And Chappell is on record, and I've heard it myself, saying, look, you're the captain. You have to make your decisions. By lunch, he was close to almost 100. And he didn't have an opening partner because Greenwich had failed in the first. Bernard Julian opened the innings, got 28, but they did, in fact, put on a fairly good opening stand. Julian was hit, broke the thumb, and, it was that kind of a start.
Yes, magnificent test, which West Indies went on to win. But of course, after that, they did end up losing the next 4 tests, and which was ended up being a 5-1 victory for Australia, and quite a challenging tour for the West Indies overall. I don't know when they lost a series so badly after that. Maybe it took another 20 years for them to lose a series in that margin, because they were so dominant after that. But one point I must ask you, and which comes through the book, and when we're talking about cricketing friendships and things, you must tell us and our listeners about the late, great Tony Cozier and the effect that he had on you and your career. And it seems that, he was so generous throughout, as it comes out in the book. And even when, you went as a freelancer to Australia, he would always make sure that you were part of any sort of event where the West Indies team was invited or where he was invited. And so he comes across as a really generous and warm man throughout.
Yes, funny enough, we first met when he was writing for his father's newspaper. And he was covering a football regional Trinidad, Barbados, Guyana 3-way tournament. I was then the appointed coach of Guyana because of my work with the Santos Football Club and the Guyana under 23. I was asked to coach side. And we met after the matches, and that was my first interaction. It didn't go too far beyond that, but that was 1965. He was already fairly well established, and there is an interesting thing about how Cozier got into commentary. He had covered the great Test match fight back partnership between Atkinson and De Pisa, where Atkinson got a double 100. His father allowed him at 15 years of age to write the Test match copy for the newspaper.
Wow. At
15, he went to Trinidad in, I think it was 1961, to cover for his father's newspaper. 9 Barbadians were in the West Indies team, so they had a brand new Barbados-looking side. And the Trinidad journalists and the Trinidad commentators were having difficulty in knowing who's bowling, who's coming out to bat. So they asked this young Barbadian to come up to the commentary box and identify, who was who. And after he did that for about maybe an hour, he was then invited to join the panel and did his first match, which was never planned and never expected. And he never looked back from that. But he was a marvelous commentator. We had different styles, and one of the things I certainly never thought of doing was trying to sing like Tony Cozier. I just simply wanted to sing like myself. But we traveled for over 40 years together.
I remember the brief interaction I had with him in 2006 even though I was a young journalist on one of my early tours, and he was already such a doyen of the profession. He was very kind and very forthcoming, and also introduced me to people at the Barbados Nation to help me with some archives and things. So yeah, it was wonderful. Tell us a bit about that Packer series that you went to, the second season of World Series cricket. People have described it as the time when cricket changed forever. How was that experience? Day-night cricket and watching the game, the money come into the game, the players getting paid more, and just the whole transformation that was around at the time. And also a lot of anger, I would say, from the establishment point of view of these mercenaries, or whatever many people were called at the time.
Just let me say quickly on Cozier. I rate Cozier as the best all-round cricket journalist the world has had. There is no other, and I don't believe that Richie Beno, the late, has ever done radio, television, and write a copy for Caribbean press and world press as Tony Cozier would have done. Radio, television, and writing. That's a lot of work. That's a lot of stress. And I think he was probably the best all-round cricket journalist the world has ever had. Now, back to your thoughts. The first Kerry Packer series lost a lot of money, lost a great deal of money. But Packer was a man of wealth. The Australian board had turned down his offer to cover the Test series on Channel 9, although his offer was below the Australian Broadcasting Corporation offer. They chose to go back to the traditional people who covered cricket in Australia. So he decided that I will start my own series. So the second year, I think they learned a lot from the first year in how they presented the media to the public. They changed a number of things. I mean, you had the International 11, you had the Australian 11, you had the West Indies 11. So there was a little bit of a cutting edge. It just wasn't an exhibition, etc. Of course, he struggled to get the main grounds. We played at Waverley outside of Melbourne, 17 miles. We played in a Australian rules ground. And that ground had one of the best displays of batting I've ever seen in my life, where Lawrence Monroe got 175 against the Australian attack. Glorious batting. 2,000 people watched it live. I think a few 100,000 would have seen it. But we couldn't get the Adelaide Oval. We had to use a much smaller ground. In Perth, we used an exhibition ground. But the turning point came where Packer was able to get the Sydney cricket ground, and the West Indies played Australia. And it started very quietly. A few hundred people came in, and somehow the other, by 4 o'clock, the crowd started to grow. And, it was the making of the Packer series. By 7 o'clock, it was almost a full house. And you could have an image of the moon coming up, and Lily is running into both of Fredericks and Greenwich. It was a fantastic scene. 50,000 people watched that match, and Packer had made the point. Packer had made the point, and I think what tended to happen after that, the court case followed, which he won, and the agreement was reached, and cricket went back to the traditional test. But the interesting rules that Richie Benaud and others came up with the circle really was a revolution. I mean, I used to watch the Gillette Cup in England, the one thing, which didn't have any constraints of how many players you can have outside of the circle. And it was boring. It was very boring because people would just keep knocking singles. Everybody will be on the ground, on the boundary, really. But the changes that the Packer organization brought into the one-day format certainly changed the game, and later adopted by the ICC.
So one of the questions I had is, Packer got the Sydney Cricket Ground because it was not a property of the Australian board, but the property of the city of Sydney, right?
That is the breakthrough he got. It wasn't controlled as the MCG was, or the Adelaide Oval was, or maybe the Gabba was. He went to the authorities who controlled the ground, and they gave permission for the Packer organization to use the New South Wales Cricket Ground.
And an additional point about Lawrence Rowe, when he made that fabulous 100, there must have been a lot of whistling. He used to whistle when he used to play his strokes, right?
Well, I couldn't quite hear it from the commentary box, but
of course.
I mean, he was such an easy mover, I mean, I remember there was one delivery outside the off stump from Lily, where he had put his left foot maybe on the line of the off stump, and in a flash, he just adjusted it about 4 inches to the right and played the greatest extra cover drive in that easy, nonchalant way. So graceful, lovely hands. He was probably the easiest thing on the eyes to watch, Lawrence George Rowe.
Yeah, it sort of seems to have brought many people so much joy. And even today, there are people who go weak in their knees when you talk about Lawrence Rowe. There was something extraordinary about him, especially on his finest days.
Well, he was a man with a great start. He made a double 100 against New Zealand. He made 100 in the second innings. And then against England, they broke the doors down at Kensington Oval, where he made a triple. He made a triple against England. Overnight, he was 42 not out, if I remember well. And that 42 not out had a display of great shots. And the public said, what? We're going back the next day. And did they go back, and did he bat?
Yeah. One series I missed out, though, in between all this was when India visited in 1976, the famous series where they had the game where they chased 400 plus to win the test, and also the next test in Sabina Park, where they sort of faced the barrage of West Indian fast bowling, including the wrath of Michael Holding, and they had to even declare before they were all out because of the quality of the bowling. Tell us a bit about that series, and also about Sabina Park, which must have been both quite a dramatic experience as well as maybe a gruesome at some level.
Well, first of all, the defeat. That defeat where India got the runs after the West Indies had declared. Lloyd obviously thought that Trinidad, traditionally a spinning track, that his spinners would have done the job. Well, they did not, and I think that led him to playing the 4 quick bowlers as a team. That led him to say, look, we can't rely on our spinners. There's no Lance Gibbs, there's no Sagari Sobers, there's no Ramin, no Valentine Rung. Let's not focus on our strength. So Minor Park is probably then the second fastest track in the Caribbean. Kensington Oval was known to be that. And the West Indies attack was just too hot, too hostile, too quick, back of a leg stuff for the Indian batsmen. And I think Mason Singh Bedi was Bedi the captain? Yeah, Mason.
Yes.
Singh Bedi decided that I can't expose my lower order to this, and the unusual result where India declared their second innings.
Absolutely. So okay. So Packer happens, and let's just move on a bit to a few years down the road when you, of course, had one of the biggest stories of your career. You write about it on the book and how anxious you were. This is about the West Indies team, the so-called rebel team that first went to South Africa in the early 80s, and how somebody whose identity we still don't know passed on this information to you, a deep throat of sorts, and basically you felt that it was credible enough to be put on air, and then you were then anxious about whether this team was actually going to fly or not because your credibility was then on the line.
Yes, Barbados was playing a regional match, Kensington, and I was on my way through the city to go to Kensington. It was about 10, 15 minutes away. And I stopped at the crosswalk for pedestrians. The light was flashing. And as I stopped, this deep throat, as you described it, came up to me and said, West Indies rebel team going to South Africa tomorrow, do your homework. And he walked away. And I went on to Kensington, and I sat there, and I was hardly seeing the practice because I was, in my head, I had, so how do I find out? How do I find out how this story can't break from London? It can't break. It's going to break from the Caribbean. And I called someone, then the airline of the Caribbean, British West Indies Airways, and I asked a young lady who I knew. She was a bit of a road runner. And I said, what are your flights out of Trinidad? And she gave me the flights. And I explained what I was trying to find out. She said, well, you will have to give me some names. I had to quickly think, now, who were on the edge of maybe breaking into the West Indies team? And I came up with a name, Emerson Trotman, who's now coaching in Barbados. And all the names, to describe her, all the names came up. So these people were going to get a flight out to Barbados and maybe on to Miami and then on to New York and Joburg, as the case may be. Well, I did go on the air about 1:05 on the Voice of Barbados, and I got the duty announcer to allow me to break the story, but I didn't call any names. I just said, there is a situation where, from all reports, the West Indies rebel team is going to South Africa. The team is scheduled to leave tomorrow, and blah, blah, blah. And, all hell broke loose, so to speak. because, you know, a lot of the Caribbean nations had backed Nelson Mandela and his party. Jamaica, Guyana had sent money, Cuba had sent soldiers, and it was a controversial type event about to take place. Well, the next morning, everybody turned up to see if I was right. If I was right, that they would have had a great story. If I was wrong, I think that would have been the end of my career because I would have lost credibility. The BB plane came out of Trinidad, arrived, and nobody got on the flight. No players got on the flight. And I really felt then that I had made an awful mistake. And I then saw someone, they call a red cap, they handled baggage. And they said, Mr. Reds, I saw Alvin Greenwich family brought his suitcase to a certain airline. And that gave me the indication that there was a bit of a decoy. So we waited for the American carrier to arrive. And it was people deplaned, people started to get on, the flight was announced. And as people were getting onto the flight, there was a screeching sound of a mini bus coming into the airport at Grantley Adams. And there emerged all the players led by Sylvester Clarke. And, you know, they already had their boarding passes. And quickly they went through immigration onto the flight. Flight was closed, but it didn't take off because Albert Padmore, who was leading the side, arrived late. I begged him for a comment, smiling, no comment. You sure about this decision, blah, blah, blah. Do you think you're going to change record in South Africa and life in South Africa? No comment. And he got on the plane and they took off. And to my relief, the story broke, and then, you know, I had 1 million calls from just about every organization in the Caribbean, and the BBC followed. The BBC followed it very, very almost day by day.
And two cricketers went through another route, right? Lawrence Rowe, who was the captain, and someone else?
And Colin Croft.
And Colin Croft. Yeah.
Yes. Colin Croft was in Jamaica being treated for his back, right? And Lawrence Rowe was also the other person who left from Jamaica. And just before that, 2 days earlier, Alan Ray, the then president, was thanking publicly Rowe and Croft for not going. And lo and behold, 2 days later, he found out that they had taken off. They had taken off.
Yeah. The sort of recriminations were quite stark, and the sort of the backlash that they felt was something that was to stay with them for the rest of their lives. They were banned for many, many years, and I think other than Ezra Mosley, none of them really got a chance to play for the West Indies after that. Mosley, of course, got a chance much later in life, the late Ezra Mosley, I must say. After all these years, Reds, what are your thoughts on that? Is that something that you feel that they should have done? Is it something that you feel that there was an overreaction to? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there are two ways of looking at it. But I do not support the view by Lawrence Rowe that their going would have changed the apartheid system. If you had simply said that there's a lot of young players who cannot make the West Indies team, here's an opportunity to look after their financial future, at least for the next couple of years, I would accept that story. But apartheid is such a vicious system. having gone to South Africa after democracy came and, heard the stories of the past and read about the slaughter at Sharpeville where 70-odd people were shot down, things like that, and the brutality of the townships, and I've actually been to some of the townships. No, I didn't ever believe that the West Indies playing in South Africa, large crowds, would have changed the apartheid system. The apartheid system was changed because of pressure, because of what was happening with the clerk having a change of mind, the release of Nelson Mandela. That was what, in fact, broke down the apartheid system. Not the West Indies playing there. Different governments took different measures. The reaction by Jamaica was, in fact, maybe the strongest, but the other territories did also take action. But the Barbadian players were allowed to come back and play for their clubs, play for Barbados, and as you point out, Ezra Mosley played 2 test matches against England and also was picked to go to Pakistan.
All right. So, yes, the Jamaican players, of course, were hit the hardest. A lot of very sad stories there around Richard Austin, Herbert Chang, and, players who had a really, really tough time later in life, which sort of then makes me forward to 83 and the India tour there, which, again, you write about in the book. One of the games that you mention, and which strikes me that which isn't talked about that much, is the test in Jamaica in 83, which was going to be rained out almost. It felt that this was a sure shot draw, but West Indies actually chased the target in really quick time in the final session and ended up winning an absolutely thrilling game. Any memories of that game? These days, there's a lot of talk about the run rates and T20 coming in and really building on the run rates in cricket. But this is one game way before the T20 age where the West Indies scored really quick to win and pull it off.
Well, the 4th day was totally washed out. We got to Sabina Park hoping that there would have been an improvement in the weather and the rain would have stopped and maybe play might have started sometime in the mid-afternoon. Sabina Park was like a mini lake, and it was felt that India was still batting and still had a fair amount of wickets in hand, and play would have been extended on the 5th day with India still batting. But the West Indies fast bowlers, Robertson and Marshall, were able to bowl India out very quickly. And all of a sudden, it was a game 1 situation, as you rightly said, almost like a 20-20, 50 over kind of format. And one of the funny things is that only 2,000 people watched the dramatic win by the West Indies because the Jamaica board didn't expect to have any kind of crowds on the last day. And when the game started with India resuming, there were very few people there. They had only opened one gate for the public area and maybe just a gate for the VIP stand and members and the media gate. All of a sudden, the crowds started to pour down at Sabina Park. They could not get the turnstiles in place. They could not get enough officials to man the gates. And a lot of people were locked out of Sabina Park and simply had to go back to radio. And very few people saw it. Initially, the West Indies started I think that Lloyd wasn't quite happy with the rate of scoring by Greenwich and Haynes, and sent out a message with someone taking a pair of gloves to, get out or get on. And that saw the rate pick up. But the man who, of course, really made the difference was Vivian Richards, because he came out and whacked the Indian bowling all over the place. So Sabina is a fairly small ground by international standards, and the West Indies rolled on to win. Dujon, I think, hit the last ball into the Kensington stand for 6, and the West Indies won. And I think everyone was shocked by the drama of the last day.
Yeah, I'm looking at the scorecard now. They chased, it was 173 for 6 in little over 25 overs. That puts the run rate at close to 7 and over. And Richards finished with 61 of 36 balls, 5 fours and 4 sixes. So, yeah, I mean, that was back for 1983. That was quite a furious chase, you can say. And, quite remarkable for that era. So 83, it's interesting. Recently, we were talking about, there's always talk about the 1983 World Cup, which of course you were there too, about that World Cup. But one of the games in that series when India were in West Indies, which really seems to come up whenever India's victory in the 83 World Cup comes up, is that one-day game in Berbice in Guyana, which India happened to win. They weren't that good at one-day cricket back then before that World Cup, but the Berbice win really gets spoken about as the beginning of the World Cup journey. Were you there at Berbice? Tell us a bit about that, about the whole atmosphere there and that game.
Yes, the game was played at the Albion ground. And the Albion Cricket Club has produced many, many Guyana players and many West Indian players. In fact, there's a left-arm spinner called Gudishish Moti, who's playing against Bangladesh in Antigua. He comes from there. It's 80 miles away, and we all went by helicopter. We went by helicopter because you had to travel about 67 miles and then cross on a ferry, and it was felt that there would have been just too much pressure on the players. Yes, it was a significant victory for India. I remember one of the things that happened that day, and maybe this was a sign that something was going to happen of a different result in the game. The scoreboard actually collapsed. The scoreboard actually collapsed. It came down, and for a brief moment, play stopped. But I think the then manager was Hanumant Singh, the former Indian batsman who probably should have played a few more test matches, started with a debut 100. And he was really delighted by the performance of India that day against a fairly strong West Indies team. You might just like to read the lineup if you got the figures close to you.
Yes, I can pull that up right now. The Indian lineup: Gavaskar, Shastri, Amarnath, Kapil Dev, Yashpal Sharma, Venkata. Similar to what the 1983 World Cup team was, they made 282 for 5 in 47 overs, and then the West Indies. Greenwich, Haynes, Richards, Lloyd, Backus, Gomes, Dujon, Marshall, Roberts, Holding, Davis, which was again pretty much the team from the 83 World Cup. 255 for 9 in when they lost the game by 27 runs.
Yes, and I think it's a good point you have made that might have been the turning point towards 1983. But I think the actual final itself, the West Indies might have simply felt that this total, was not a major total, and that there's enough batting in the West Indies lineup to get that very, very quickly. I think one turning point would have been Richards being caught by Kapil Dev. He was at mid-wicket. He had to turn, run away from the square, sprinted a good, I think, 20 meters, and managed to stick his hands out and picked up what was a superb catch, because Richards was really starting to counter-attack, and India were losing a very strong position. But after Richard went, the fall of wickets, it was just like ninpins. Nobody stayed. There was a small partnership, I think, between Dujan and maybe Marshall. But the West Indies had lost too many early wickets.
Yeah, you do mention in the book that perhaps had West Indies been chasing 250 or more, that they would have approached the chase totally differently and might have actually won. But because the total was so small, their sort of the way they went about it was perhaps not ideal. And maybe if Richards had stayed 10 more minutes, the game would have been over, but who knows?
And I think also Lloyd had picked up an injury. Lloyd had picked up an injury in the field, and his movement in the middle was in fact restricted, and he may have considered maybe dropping down in the order, maybe sending Gomes a little higher.
Yeah, maybe. There is, Malcolm Marshall, again, as you mentioned, played in that final and ended up that he never won a World Cup. I mean, he hadn't played in 79, I think, in that 79 World Cup. So how was it after the game? Was it, I've heard that there was quite a bit of tears in the West Indies dressing room and some sort of a huge disappointment at the opportunity missed.
Well, I didn't get to the dressing room, but right across the road, both India and the West Indies, thinking positively, had arranged some kind of a function. It could have been to celebrate the victory or celebrate losing, or if you can celebrate losing. And I was invited to go across to the hotel, which was just across the road from the Lord's Gate. And to get to the West Indies reception room, you had to go past the Indian reception. And there was tassa drums, there were all kinds of Indian singing and celebrations, and the mood was one of success, one of happiness, one of a historical win. And then you got to the West Indies function room, and it was totally flat. Nobody hardly saying too much. I think a couple of the people were trying to lift the spirits, but it was not a very nice reception. All the arrangements were there. I mean, it was a properly planned reception, but the surprise loss was just too much to handle. I came out after about 40 minutes, and I probably would have stayed longer if the victory was the other way around. I hailed a taxi. I got into the back, and I was going to have an Indian meal in Edgware Road. And it was a driver of either African origin or West Indian origin. And he turned to me and he said, "You lot didn't do too well today, did you?" He simply cut himself off by having any affiliation with the West Indies.
He distanced himself from his West Indian identity.
Yeah, you lot didn't do very well today, did you?
He took on his English identity then, I guess.
But then, of course, to follow, the West Indies went to India in '83. As your
and you went too.
Show. Yep.
And you went too. Yep.
Yes.
And there was sort of a don't like to use the word revenge, but yeah, there was a considerable sort of statement made there by the emphatic way in which they won that series, right?
Yes, and I think Venkata probably felt more pressure as an Indian batsman than anybody else. But you have to admire the skills of Jimmy Amanat in the West Indies in '83 and in India in '83. I mean, he probably, and there are many players that will fall in this bracket. He was an underrated Indian batsman, Jimmy Amanat.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that was his a great year when he had fabulous tours to Pakistan, to West Indies, the World Cup, of course, where he was the man of the match in the semi-final and final, and the home series against West Indies, ended up being... was that your first trip to India, Reds, or had you been there in '77 with Kalicharan's team?
No. I was in Australia. Don't forget when Kalicharan's team was there. 78 was Packer. We were listening, myself and Tony, because we would listen to the commentary in the morning before getting a taxi to go to whichever game. No. My first trip to India was 1983, and I want to say the late Hanman Singh played a great role in making me extremely comfortable by putting me on to a lot of people, and invited me with his wife to spend a week with them in Cuff Parade. So I actually lived in an Indian home, Indian flat for a period of the week, observing all the Indian cultures, which was not strange to me because I come from Guyana, where half of the population are from India originally.
Yes. So about that tour, tell us a bit about that, because, when you talk about fast bowling, of course you have fast bowlers who do well in England and Australia and the Caribbean and South Africa. But the West Indian fast bowlers of that time was so good that they managed to excel even on the subcontinent. And one of the exemplars of that was, of course, Malcolm Marshall, who had such a fantastic time in 1983. People talk about that test in Kanpur when he got those wickets, but there was also, the test in Calcutta where he did so well. And throughout the series, I mean, he must have been one of the most astonishing bowlers to watch, and one of the smartest fast bowlers to have ever played the game.
And one of the smallest.
Smallest.
I actually met Harry Larwood from the great Bodyline series. He was at the Sydney Cricket Ground as a special guest many years later. And I would think that the Malcolm Marshall was maybe just an inch or two smaller. But yeah, you talk about Kanpur. He should have also gotten 100 there, because he got out into the 90s. And I think one is, there were two regrets, I suppose, in his life, that he didn't get a World Cup medal, because for some strange reason in 92, he was left out in Melbourne. And he swears that the late Marshall, that he wasn't injured. And he never got a Test 100. But he had the ability to bowl around the wicket where many fast bowlers would have struggled. He was totally as good over the wicket than around the wicket. He was also very good. And he had pace. He could move the ball. He had just about everything. And, when you go back to selections, he went to India under Kalisharani that you mentioned. I think he picked up 3 wickets on that tour. But the West Indies selectors knew that, that he had the potential to be very great. It's like the selection of Holding to Australia in 75, 76. The selection of Shivnarayan Chandrabol against England at Border, where he came in out of the blue, surprise selection. But they wanted somebody who could stay in the middle order. And, the rest is well known about the selection of Shiv Chandrabol.
Yes, I once asked Geoffrey Dujon, the wicketkeeper from the Great West Indies team, to, if he were to pick out all the fast bowlers that he kept to, who would he think he was the best? And then he went through each one by one. And then finally he came to Marshall and he said, Malcolm Marshall had what every one of these above bowlers had. And he also had that little extra skid when he would pitch the ball at a length that you would think you could drive, but then it would be at your chest height because the ball would just take off. Is that an assessment you agree with, that Marshall was perhaps the first among equals?
Yes, consistently. I mean, there are others, who would bowl fast. I mean, going back to Wesley Hall, I mean, he was genuinely quick, but of course, in that time, you didn't have a speed gun to check Hall. But if there's another name that I would like to add, the late Sylvester Clarke, who played for Surrey and played very few test matches. People who have kept to him would say that he was very, very quick and very hostile. But didn't have a long enough career, I suppose, to back up that kind of feeling about Sylvester Clarke. But I'm sure you can do your own research. Not very many English batsmen in the English county season likes the fact that they were playing Surrey next week.
Absolutely. Sylvester Clarke also went to South Africa on the Rebel Tour and so couldn't play for the West Indies after that. But I remember in the early 90s, it might have been 93 or 94, there was this series of veterans who came to India to play a series. This was all the players who had retired, and Sylvester Clarke was one of them who came. And he was bowling as quick as many of the current international bowlers were bowling at that time. And there were commentators, in fact, saying Sylvester Clarke can perhaps walk into 5 or 6 international teams even now at this age.
He was a big man, barrel-chested, the way how Colin Croft would be square on as he bowled. And you were reminding me of a time which was the lowest time of my life, because once that tour that you talked about was going on, I think it was sponsored by a soft drink company. I was lying in a Sydney hospital suffering from a stroke, suffering from a stroke. And the West Indies team was playing the next day at the Sydney Cricket Ground. I decided not to go out on New Year's night, got hit by a stroke on New Year's morning, and got an email orchestrated by Tony Koshan, signed by all the players, that somehow or the other arrived at the hospital, St. Vincent, and onto my room. It was really very touching, very touching.
Yes, this must have been the New Year's Day in 1996, the day when, which of course cricket fans might remember, was the day when Michael Bevan hit Roger Harper over his head for 4 of the last ball of the day to win that thrilling one-day game. But of course, Reds was not there because in the morning of that, he had suffered a stroke and he had to go to the hospital. And it was, you talk about it, in detail in the book, and how life-changing an experience it was. But one of the things that really struck me at that time was that when you were in the hospital and after you had basically, after you was done with the tough part, and when you were, trying to figure out if you are getting better, you wondered if you had lost your memory. And one of the things that you did was you did a self-diagnosis by saying, let me try and remember something from as way far back as I can remember. And one of the cricketing memories came back to you. That was so touching for me to read, that the first thing that you went back to was a cricketing memory.
Yes, it's a British guy who was playing Barbados, and Leslie White and Glennon Gibbs, who both made double centuries, put an opening stand of 390 on the board. And I also remembered, I didn't put it in the book, I remembered the Indian lineup of Pankaj Roy and Ellen Mapti and Mandraker and Umrigar and Patkar and that lineup. So my memory seemed to be then in fairly good shape, thankfully.
Yes, and it continues to be in good shape even today. So were you calling the game in the test in 1992 when South Africa came back into the fold and played against West Indies and Barbados, that famous match where they had a total to chase where, they were chasing 201 runs. They were 122 for 2, and then they collapsed thanks to Ambrose and Walsh. Were you calling that game?
Yes, myself and Tony Cozier called that game. And there was a South African commentator. His name will come to me in a short while. But
was it Neil Mantov?
No, it wasn't Neil Mantov.
Okay. Yeah.
It will come to me. And the interest about that game was the fact, not the historical, South Africa returning to the international fold. There was a boycott when a medium fast bowler, Andy Cummins, was not selected. He was Barbadian. And there was, in fact, a boycott by the Barbadian public, because I think it was Winston Benjamin who, in fact, was selected in his place. So very few people saw that great West Indies victory on the last day. And from all reports, the South Africans had their champagne already on ice. They had their celebrations all planned. And Walsh and Ambrose, I remember the amount of catches that Williams took. He might have taken about 5 catches if you got the scorecard available.
Yeah, I see David Williams got 3 catches and 2 of Ambrose and 1 of Walsh. And David Williams was perhaps one of the shortest cricketers to play the game, and Curtly Ambrose was one of the tallest. So it was always a sight to see both of them celebrating after the wicket and giving each other high fives.
Yeah, it was a Mutt and Jeff kind of situation. But that was a dramatic win. I mean, South Africa seemed to be going along steadily towards victory. But the old saying, you take 1, you take 2. Yes. And then the rest will follow. It was really a dramatic collapse that happened in Kensington that day in front of about 2,000 people, if not much.
Yeah, there was that famous banner that said "No Cummins, no goings." Right? I mean that basically said that if no Andy Cummins and nobody plays. What about the forwarding maybe 6 years later to or maybe 7 years later to another test at Kensington, which of course far more than 2,000 people watched. This was of course the famous match where Brian Lara made 153 and beat Australia, in that absolutely riveting chase. Was that a game where that you called, and what are your memories of it?
No, that's a game I did not call. I want to be totally honest. It clashed with what I was doing, but what a great innings. And, batting with the tail. Lara really showed his class. And he did that. Earlier in the tour in Jamaica, where himself and Jimmy Adams had batted all day.
Yes, absolutely. 214, and which, of course, an innings that Tony Cozier has rated as one of the greatest innings he saw, because given the context of what Lara was going through, and after being defeated in South Africa 5-0, I think West Indies got blanked in South Africa, and then to come back to be under that pressure to perform like that, he has said was so good. But tell us a bit about Lara, though. I mean, I'm sure apart from that game, you would have called so many other games that he played. There must be something so inspiring for a commentator to have a batsman like Lara to call, right? Because he made the game that much more beautiful and that much more, I would say, extraordinary.
He was genius, When he broke the record in Antigua, Woody Richards did an interview with me and said, how would you describe Lara? I said, genius. He had the ability to play just about every shot in the book. He was extremely confident as a person. He played pace and spin equally well. And, he had the ability just to rise above the occasion, when things were in fact necessary. I had the honor of doing his first test match. It was against India, where himself and Hooper put together a pretty good partnership. Hooper went on to make a pretty good 100 against, it was against Pakistan, and Lara got 42. But there were some people felt that he should have played Test cricket earlier than that. But when he started, he hardly looked back.
So you were in Lahore for that test, Lara's debut?
Yes, I was in Lahore for that test. It was my only tour to South Africa. And if you look at the Pakistan line, to Pakistan. And it was a very small debut, but it was a sign of things to come. The Pakistan team was extremely strong. The bowling lineup, extremely strong. I mean, I think
looking at the scorecard now, Imran Khan, Wasim Akram, Waqar Yunus, Abdul Qadir. I mean, that's perhaps one of the four of the greatest bowlers Pakistan have produced.
And there was a good left-arm spinner also in the Pakistan side.
Masood Anwar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the West Indies, of course, if I remember well, I lost the first test. And it was only a three-match series, which unfortunately was maybe just too short.
Yeah, it was drawn 1-1. West Indies did manage to win one test. This was the third test, which ended up being a draw. But Lara's debut, which was very famous. Reds, when you say when Lara broke the record in Antigua, you need to clarify when, because he did it twice.
Well, I was talking on the first occasion. On the first occasion, yes. Well, I mean, that was very special because you grew up knowing that Len Hutton had made 364 against Australia, and then he wasn't Sir Garfield then Garfield Sobers broke it against Pakistan as a minor, and you wonder if anybody will ever were able to do that. Lawrence Rowe got a triple, but not very many got that far.
Yes. In fact, when he broke the record in Antigua for the first time, 375, there's this wonderful video of the footage of Sir Gary Sobers running into the ground and to congratulate him. And how beautiful that, it's almost like literally passing the baton from one great to the other. And Lara went on, of course, to reclaim the record from Matthew Hayden many years later and holds it to this day. One thing I wanted to talk to you about as we get towards the end of this chat is the 2007 World Cup, where you make no bones about the fact that that it wasn't, the World Cup didn't turn out as it should have, and you are critical of the World Cup despite being involved in it. Talk a bit about that, and where maybe 2 or 3 things which could have made that World Cup so much better.
One, the charges for the tickets were out of whack. The charges for the tickets were out of whack. Because in the preliminary games, there was just maybe one game of an outstanding potential. And for example, that game in St. Lucia was South Africa, Australia, which turned out to be a major disappointment because the game was over very, very early. And there were many games like that where the charges were just over the top. I want to go back to the time it was held in the Caribbean. At that time is when our hotels are normally filled. So we didn't need a World Cup to fill the hotels. And maybe the World Cup should have come later. But I don't believe the English authorities probably wanted the World Cup towards the end of April because it might have clashed with their own English season. But to have a World Cup when that period of time is normally booked, I just didn't sort of make any real sense. I thought it was a missed opportunity.
Yeah, I think the Caribbean flavor was really lost because of the rules that were imposed on it. There were, of course, the musicality of the grounds was absent because the crowds weren't even allowed to take their conch shells and all the musical instruments that they used to come in. The tickets were exorbitant, and the tournament itself seemed to go on forever. I mean, there was a joke recently when Nasser Hussain said, I think the 2007 World Cup is still going on somewhere. So it could have been so much better, given that who knows when West Indies are going to get another chance to host a World Cup. Hopefully the T20 at some point, but let's see.
But just to come back to things that happened that didn't help, when India lost in Port of Spain to, was it Bangladesh?
And yeah, Pakistan, but they lost both to Bangladesh and, they lost to Bangladesh and Pakistan lost to Ireland.
And that didn't help the crowd because a lot of the Indian, and I remember for the final, outside of Kensington, you had Indian supporters standing on the pavement offering their tickets for whatever they can get. As far as they're concerned, India was not playing, time to go home. And, I think the same could have been said of the Pakistanis because we had a lot of support from people from India and Pakistan who live in North America,
Yeah, and there was that famous incident of India was scheduled to play Pakistan in that match during one of the second stage of that World Cup, and several fans had booked specifically for that game, and they ended up watching Bangladesh versus Ireland in the end.
I mean, the crowds in Guyana were waiting for the tournament to get to that stage, and never saw what they expected for teams to come true.
All right. So last couple of questions. The first one, there are a number of young listeners of our podcast. They may be interested in getting into commentary, broadcasting, and these days there are different avenues in which you can actually go about this online. Technology is improving to an extent where you can actually talk on podcasts and all these other spaces and other means and put your commentary out there. What would you say to them? What would you say is a couple of bits of advice for them to actually keep as a guiding lights going forward?
Well, any young commentator, male or female, I would advise that they have to follow the game. They have to follow the game. And after following the game, for a period of a good year, if they can get a tape recorder and simply go to a first-class match or go to any match and do like a report, an imaginary report on the state of the game after one team is bowled out, or do a 10-minute report at lunch, or do a closer play report, and play it back, and get that kind of experience of calling a game. Because a young person who maybe get a job to do reports at lunch, tea, and close for a radio station really need to practice along those lines. Nobody is going to walk off the road and do ball by ball commentary. I mean, this is an era of technology where you have Cricinfo, you have all sorts of aids to help you. You have smartphones, so the information is there. When I started, there was no such thing. There was Reuters, a news agency that you probably had to rely on whatever BBC might put out. And I think one way is to go about a simple way of getting a tape recorder, go to the ground, and give yourself some imaginary on-air practice. And then you can then develop that, present it to organizations, and you just may be able to get a break in.
Yes, and these days you may not even need to present it to any organization, because you might develop a sort of a listenership by yourself and your own platform. Yeah, and that would really help in building your profile.
Yeah, certainly that's a simple way to start. Don't start too ambitiously. Keep it simple and develop confidence. Confidence is very, very important.
And about the calling itself, I mean, the bits that I've heard from you, it seems that you were one of those commentators who was always very even-keeled about the commentary. You were descriptive, but at the same time, you were not somebody who was unnecessarily going overboard or getting into hyperbole. You seem to have a very efficient way of commentary, and talk a bit about that and the importance of that.
Well, I think I learned very quickly. You never go to do a game to expect a victory. Don't go to do a game and expect the West Indies will win. Go and do a game and call the game as the game develop. And therefore, you would be fair, you would be balanced, and you will do justice to both sides. I have always felt that one or two English commentators, set themselves up. So when England didn't win, they found themselves in a little embarrassing situation. And I made sure that I saw a test match as very sacred. I saw the opening day of a test match as almost very special. The ground staff preparing activities around the ground. advertising boards being put up at last minute, crowds starting to come in, and then the players would arrive, and eventually the toss would be spun. I thought there was something very, very sacred about the opening day of a test match. Very, very, very sacred. But I take the point. I'm very happy you felt that way. You have to be balanced. You have to be fair.
Yes. And lastly, if you have to go back in your illustrious career to one session or one game, which you have a chance to recall, to go back and re-commentate on, would there be any such day? Something that has stayed with you for so long that you are like, that was such a great day to be a commentator for that game or passage?
Well, it will have to be the 1975 World Cup final, when the West Indies played Australia. I mean, it was a Prudential Cup. I was a young commentator. Millions are listening to you, and you're aware of the importance of the audience, and that had to be maybe the highlight of my career. I mean, it was a great honor. The most tension in a test match is when the West Indies won by 1 run at Adelaide. McDermott caught Junior Murray off the bowling of Walsh. The tension was immense in that game. The Pakistan-West Indies doesn't quite fit the bill, but that was extremely tense. But that was an ODI game. But when you do a lot, you can't quickly sometimes think of all, but quickly responding to you, that will be maybe the ones I will underscore.
And one batsman that you would, if you had to choose, one batsman that you would watch and one bowler that you would watch, if you were given a choice. It could be anyone, not just West Indian. It could be anyone.
I would leave that outside the off stump. I will play no shot in that. Because there's such a thin line between greatness, such a thin line between great bowlers. No, I will play no shot at that.
Well, I'm not asking you to actually call the greatest of them and judge. I'm just saying that it's somebody that you would like to watch as a pure, spectacle, as a batsman, as a bowler, just like for the drama of it.
Well, I can certainly name one person, Sir Garfield Sobers.
and it's both batsman and bowler in one.
Yes, exactly. Well, I mean, he can bowl back of the arm spin, he can bowl left arm orthodox, he can bowl seam, and when he wanted, he can bowl really fast. I think Sobers was the total cricketer, the total cricketer. I mean, one of the people I never saw was George Headley, but he must have been very, very special, very special. I mean, he was the equivalent of Sir Donald Bradman, and played very few test matches. But when you see the amount of runs he pulled together in a short career, because he was robbed of some 7 or 8 war years. I mean, we played no cricket after 39 until 1948.
Mm-hmm. And talking about leaving things outside off stump, I think the question that you have left outside off stump all your life is about the identity of the person who gave you the news about the Rebel tour to South Africa. You have never revealed that, have you? Deep Throat.
I have never revealed that, and that was the promise I made.
Yes, fantastic. As a journalist, a great journalist never reveals his sources, as they say. And thank you so much, Reds. This was such a fantastic conversation for me. Learned so much, and such a rich career that you've had, and so grateful that you are able to share so much of that knowledge and experience And I'm sure our listeners would have greatly benefited from it, and I would urge them to listen to it multiple times, because you might have missed something the first time.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. You certainly pushed the old memory back, maybe back too much, but your question was spontaneous, and I tried to answer honestly. And let me keep a promise. It was Gerald de Kock who came with the South African team to Barbados.
Oh, yes, I should have mentioned Gerald de Kock. Yes, I sort of guessed that it could be him. I would urge our listeners to also pick up this book called Living My Dreams. It is a wonderful read, talks a lot about Reds' life and career. And as I said earlier, it's much more than cricket. It's a lot about the other sports that he's covered, the work that he's done, the Olympics, and so many other sports that Reds talks about, his journeys, his travels, his friendships. And as for our listeners, the usual call out, 81allout.com is our website. Please subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen to them. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google, we are everywhere. Review the podcast if you like it. Rate it. It'll really help more listeners. And as you know, we are also recently republishing old cricket books. War Minus the Shooting by Mike Marquesee was a book we republished late last year, and we are on the verge of publishing another book soon, and we will reveal that to you, in a week or so. Thank you so much, and see you for the next episode.
India have won the Test match. India have won the series. They're going to get back for two. India at home. Lords goes wild.